The importance The importance of the craft of the armorer in the Middle Ages can hardly be overestimated, for it is to a large extent to the excellence of defensive armor and weapons that we owe much of the development of art and craftsmanship all over Europe. The reason for this somewhat sweeping statement is to be found in the fact that up to the 16th century, the individual and the personal factor were of supreme importance in war. And it was the individual whose needs the armorer studied. In the days when military organization was in its infancy and the leader was endowed by his followers with almost supernatural qualities, the battle was often won by the prowess of the commander, or lost by his death or disablement. It would be tedious to quote more than a few instances of this importance of the individual in war, but the following are typical of the spirit which pervaded the medieval army. At the Battle of Hastings, when William was supposed to have been killed, he rallied his followers by lifting his helmet and riding through the host, crying, "I am here, and by God's grace, I shall conquer." The success of Joan of Arc need hardly be mentioned, as it is an obvious example of the change which could be effected in the spirit of an army by a popular leader. This importance of the individual was realized by the leaders themselves, and, as a safeguard, it was often the custom to dress one or more knights like the sovereign or commander to draw off the attack. At Bosworth Field, Richmond had more than one knight who personated him. Shakespeare gives the number as 5, for Richard says, "There be 6 Richmonds in the field, 5 have I slain instead of him." When the importance of the leader is realized, it will be obvious that the craft of the man who protected him in battle was of the utmost importance to the state. And when once this is admitted, we may fairly consider that And when once this is admitted, we may fairly consider that in an age of ceaseless wars and private raids, the importance of all other applied arts which followed in the train of a victorious leader depended to a very great extent on the protection afforded him by his armor. It would be indeed superfluous to dwell upon the artistic influences which may be traced directly to the military operations of the Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, and at a later date, the northern tribes of Europe, for every writer on the subject bases his opinions upon this foundation. In more modern periods, the conquest of Spain by the Moors introduced a type of design which has never been wholly eradicated from Spanish art, and in our own country, the Norman conquest gave us a dignified strength of architecture which would never have been established as a national phase of art if the victory had been to Harold and the English. The improvements in the equipment and military organization of the foot soldier in the 13th and 14th century necessitated a more complete style of defensive armor for the mounted man, and the elaborate leg armor of plate may be directly traced to the improvement in the weapons of the former. As is the case at the present day in the Navy, the race between weapon and defense was ceaseless, each improvement of the one being met by a corresponding improvement in the other, till the perfection of the firearm ruled any form of defense out of the competition. More peaceful influences were at work, however, due to the interchange of visits between European princes and German and Italian fashions of armor, as well as of the other applied arts, competed with each other all over Europe, though their adoption may generally be traced to a ruler of note like Maximilian or Charles V. So without undue exaggeration, we may fairly claim for the craft of the armor a foremost place as one of the chief influences in the evolution of modern art, and as such an important factor in the development of all the arts which follow in the train of conquest. There are certain essential rules which must be observed in the practice of every craft, but in most cases only one or two are necessary for the production of good work, because of the limitations either of the craft or of the needs of those for whom it is practiced. It would be out of place to go through the various applied arts and to consider the rules which guide them, but on examination of these rules as they apply to the craft of the armorer, it will be seen how each and all are essential for the production of satisfactory work. The rules are these: 1. Suitability for purpose. 2. Convenience in use. 3. Recognition of material. 4. Soundness of constructional methods. 5. Subservience of decoration to the preceding rules. It may be advantageous to examine these rules one by one and see how they are observed to the full in the best specimens of armor and how their neglect produced inferior work. 1. Suitability for purpose. The object of defensive armor was to protect the wearer from attack of the most powerful weapon in use at the period when it was made. This was obtained not only by thickness of metal, but also by so fashioning the planes of the metal that they presented a glancing surface to the blow. An early example of this consideration of the needs of the wearer is to be found in the first additions of plate to the suit of mail which were made in the leg armor of the 13th century. The reason for this was the increased efficacy of the weapons of the foot soldier, who naturally attacked the legs of the mounted man. Attacked the legs of the mounted man. The use of mail was far from practical except in the form of gussets or capes, which could not be made so conveniently in plate. The mail armor of the 13th century was only a partial protection, for although it defended the wearer from arrows and from sword cut or lance thrust, it was but little protection against the bruise of the blow. Even when, as always, the case, a padded garment was worn underneath. Up to the 16th century, the shield was used for this reason and provided a smooth, movable surface which the knight could oppose to the weapon and thus present a glancing surface to the blow. An examination of a suit of armor of the 15th century will show how this glancing surface was studied in every part. The lames of the arm pieces are overlapped downwards so that the blow might slip off. and the elbow cup presents a smooth rounded surface which will directly direct the blow off the arm of the wearer. The breastplate, which was at first simply smooth and rounded, became in the 16th century fluted, and a practical experiment will show that when the thrust of a lance, the favorite weapon at that time, met one of these flutings, it was directed to the strong ridge at neck or armhole and thence off the body. The upstanding neck guards, wrongly called pass guards, were also intended to protect the weak part where helmet and gorge met. The fan plate of the knee piece protected the bend of the knee, especially when bent in riding, the normal position of the mounted man, and the solerets were so fashioned that the foot was best protected when in the stirrup. The helm and helmet are especially good examples of the craft of the armorer in this respect. The early flat-topped helm of the 13th century was soon discarded because it was found that the full force of the downward blow was felt, which was not the case when the skull of the headpiece was pointed or rounded. A treatise on the subject of military equipment in the 15th century distinctly enjoins that the rivets on the helm should be filed flat. Et les autres ont la teste du clos limée afin que les rochers n'y prennent. This is not often found in existing helms, but the fact that it is mentioned shows that the smooth surface of the helm was an important consideration. In helms made for jousting, these considerations were minutely studied by the armorer. For the object of jousters in the 16th century was simply to score points and not to injure each other. The ocularium of the jousting helm is narrow, and is so placed that it is only of use when the wearer bends forward with his lance in rest. The lance was always pointed across the horse's neck and was directed to the left side of his opponent. Therefore, the left side of the helm is always smooth with no projection or opening. These are found in cases where they occur on the right side, where there would be no chance of their catching the lance point. Again, the skull and front plate of the helm are generally thicker than those at the back, where there is no chance of a blow being delivered. 2. Convenience of use. Besides protecting the fighting man, the armorer had to remember that his patron had to ride, sometimes to walk, and always to use his arms with convenience, and at the same time had to be protected while doing so. At first, the cuirass was made simply in two pieces, the back and the front fastened under the arms, with straps. In the middle of the 15th century, each of these was made in two or more pieces joined with a rivet, working loose in a slot cut in the uppermost of the plates so that a certain amount of movement on the torso was possible. The pauldrons, which often appear unnecessarily large, almost meeting in front, and, as is the case in the statue of Goglione in Venice, crossing at the back, are so made that they would protect the armpit when the arm was raised in striking a blow. The upper part of the armpiece, or rerebrace, is made of overlapping lames held together by sliding rivets, which allows a certain amount of play outwards and forwards, but the defense becomes rigid if the arm is moved backwards, for this movement is not necessary in delivering a blow. The arm and leg pieces are hinged with metal hinges on the outside of the limb and fastened with straps or hooks and staples on the inside. In most cases, modern theatrical armor errs in this respect, for it is obvious that if the straps were on the outside, the first object of the enemy would be to cut them and render the armor useless. The vambrace or cannon at the lower portion of the rerebrace are in single cylindrical plates, for here no movement is possible independently from the shoulder and elbow. The rerebrace, however, is generally formed with a collar, which turns into a groove bossed out in the upper portion so that the arm can turn outwards or inwards without moving the shoulder. The cuisse and the front and back of the jambe are, for the same reasons, each made in one piece, joined to the knee cup and sollerate by narrow lames working loose on rivets. The cuisse only covers the top part of the thigh for convenience on horseback, and wherever a cuisse is found that protects the back of the thigh, we may be sure that the owner fought on foot. The soleret is made so that the foot can move naturally in walking. The upper part is formed of small lames working on loose rivets and overlapping downwards towards the center plate, which covers the tread of the foot. Beyond this, the toe plates overlap upwards, and thus perfect freedom of movement is obtained. The various forms of headpiece all more or less exemplify this need of convenience in use, for they protected the head and at the same time gave us much opportunity for seeing, hearing, and breathing as was compatible with their defensive qualities. The armet or close helmet is perhaps the most ingenious, with its single or double visor, which could be lifted up so as to leave the face completely exposed till the moment of attack, when it was closed and fastened with a locking hook. Examples of the armorer adapting his work to the requirements of his patron are to be found in the globose helm for fighting at barriers made by one of the Misaglia family. Here the vision slits were evidently found to be too large and too dangerous to the wearer. An inner plate was added with smaller holes, through which no weapon used at barriers could penetrate. A second example shown has a plate added at the lower edge to increase the height of the helm, which suggests that the last wearer had a longer neck than the original owner. This convenience in use is also to be noticed in the gauntlet, which, as the science of sword play developed, was gradually discarded in favor of a defense formed of the ports or rings on the sword hilt. In jousting armor, there was only one position to be considered, namely the position with hand on bridle and lance in rest. The armorer therefore strove to protect his patron when he assumed that position alone. The arm defenses of jousting armor, with elbow guard and poldermiton, would be useless if the wearer had to raise his arm with a sword, but when the lance was held in rest, the plates of the defenses were so arranged that every blow slipped harmlessly off. As the right hand was protected with the large shield or vamplate fixed to the lance, a gauntlet for this hand was frequently dispensed with, and as the left hand was only employed to hold the reins, a semi-cylindrical plate protected the hand instead of the articulated gauntlet in use on the field of war. Horse armor or barding was of necessity more cumbrous, and but little was attempted beyond the covering of the vital parts of the body with plates or padded trappings. Mail was used for the whole bard. In the 13th century, as we know from the decorations in the painted chamber at Westminster. It was still in use for the neck defense or crenette in the middle of the 15th century. Examples of the latter are to be found in Paris and in the Wallace collection. Some attempt to make an articulated suit was evidently made, for we have a portrait of Harnischmeister Albrecht 1480, mounted on a horse whose legs are completely covered by articulated plates, similar to those on human armor. A portion of the leg piece of this or of a similar suit is in the Musée Porte de Halle, Brussels. Besides the obvious advantage of plate armor over mail for defensive purposes, it should be noted that in the former, the weight is distributed over the body and limbs, while with the latter, the whole equipment hangs from the shoulders, with possibly some support at the waist. Hence, the movements of the mail-clad man were much hampered, both by the weight of the fabric, and also by the fact that in bending the arm or leg, the mail would crease and folds, and would thus both interfere with complete freedom, and would probably produce a sore from chafing. 3. Recognition of material. It would seem at first sight superfluous to give examples of this when considering armor, but in the 16th century, when the craftsman desired to show off his technical skill, we find many suits made to imitate the puffed and slashed velvets and silks of civilian dress. A notable example of this is to be found on the famous engraved suit made by Conrad Sossenhofer for Henry VIII in the Tower, in which the cloth bases or skirts of civilian dress are imitated in metal. The human form, head, and torso were also counterfeited in metal in the 16th century, with no great success from the technical point of view. 4. Soundness of constructional methods. This rule is really contained in those that have preceded it, but some notice should be paid to the various methods of fastening different plates and portions of the suit together. There are many ingenious forms of turning hook and pin by which these plates can be joined or taken apart at will. The sliding rivet is one of the most important of these constructional details. The lower end of the rivet is burred over the back of the lower plate, and the upper plate has a slot cut of less width than the rivet head, but sufficiently long to allow the plate to move backwards and forwards, generally from 3/4 to 1 inch. 5. Subservience of decoration to the preceding rules. The best suits are practically undecorated, but at the same time, there are many which are ornamented with incised or engraved lines and gilding which do not detract from the utility of the armor. This last rule is best understood by examples of the breach rather than the observance, so we may take the rules in order and see how each was broken during that period known as the Renaissance. 1. The glancing surface was destroyed by elaborate embossing, generally of meaningless designs, in which the point or edge of a weapon could catch. 2. The convenience was also impaired by the same methods, for the limbs and different portions of the suit could not play easily one over the other if each had designs in high relief. Plates were set at unpractical angles, sometimes overlapping upwards, in which the weapon could catch and would not glance off. We find that foot armor was made in the 16th and 17th centuries with the limbs all overlapping upwards and downwards, and with no center plate for the tread. In the suit given to Henry, Prince of Wales, by the Prince de Joinville in 1608. The limbs of the soleret all overlap downwards. It will be obvious that with such a foot covering it would be impossible to walk with ease. 3. The observance of this rule may be taken as a matter of course, and its neglect has been noticed above. 4. The careless arrangement of the foot armor, as mentioned in number 2, is an example of the disregard of this rule. Another instance is the embossing the metal of various parts of the suit so as to simulate lames or separate plates. They do not ornament the suit and, of course, do not add to its convenience. They merely create a false impression and save the craftsman some labor. The same may be said of the clos perdus, or false rivets, which are found in late suits, doing no work in the construction of the suit, but giving an appearance of constructional work which is lacking. 5. One has only to keep the above rules in mind and then to examine an embossed suit by Piccinino or Pevenhauser to see how this rule was broken to the detriment of the work as a good piece of craftsmanship, though perhaps the result may have increased the artistic reputation of the craftsman. It should be noticed that the craftsmen of the Renaissance, in spite of its disregard of the craft rules, did not deteriorate as a worker, for some of the suits of the Negrolis or of the 2 above-mentioned armorers could hardly be equaled at the present day as specimens of metalwork, but his energies were directed into different channels, and his reputation as an honest craftsman suffered. By the 16th century, everything concerned with the defensive qualities and the constructional details of armor had been discovered and carried to a high pitch of perfection. The craftsman therefore had to find some way of exhibiting his dexterity. Add to this the love of ostentation and display of his patron. One of the most noticeable traits of the so-called Renaissance. And we find that by degrees the old craft excellence became neglected in the advertisement of the craftsman and the ostentation of his patron.